And we're live back with another show. CannaSphere Africa is here. We come to you every Tuesday on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and all of those interweb things. In a few weeks, we'll be coming to you in something a little bit more, but I'm not going to tell you about that until next week. Some very exciting things coming up. So we've got a busy week today. We've got Noxy, who's going to be talking about TV weed moms that we love. Jeff is going to be talking about personalized DNA testing and how they're matching DNA testing with the type of cannabis profile that you need, which is very interesting, very exciting. Dr. Carmen is going to talk about cannabis and fatigue. I think all of us are fatigued at the moment with everything that's going on. COVID seems to be spiking its little head again in South Africa, and all these things that we have to deal with every day causes a lot of fatigue. And so she's going to talk about how cannabis can help with that. And unfortunately, Cuban Zulu is man down with COVID. So he will not be joining us today. So sending you lots of love from the CannaSphere team. Cuban, get well soon. But first of all, Mr. Linder, what are the headlines? I forgot to mention, again, Green Smoke Room Seeds. They are the proud sponsor of this month's episodes. So if you want to buy seeds of great genetics, check out Green Smoke Room Seeds. They've got some fantastic opportunities and offers that you can get genetics and seeds from. Right. Linda, welcome.
How's it? No, very good, very good. So the headlines are looking very spicy and very interesting. The Pondoland farmers, cannabis farmers are losing their market share to commercial strains. So the local land races are not being well represented and being bought by everybody. 2,300 new comments on the cannabis bill ahead of the 13th of May submissions deadline. So if any of you want to say anything, there's a lot of submissions. So let's hope there's going to be some interesting reforms to that bill. Cannabis stakeholders say Drugs and Medicine Act are holding back the cannabis reform. And then the last story, which is rather an interesting one, is that CSRI and Afriplex develop healthier hemp-based poultry feed.
That's the thing. We talk about the fact that cannabis is good nutritionally for us, but what we aren't talking about a lot, and we are aware, is that cannabis can also be incredibly nutritious for animal feed. It's clean, it's pesticide free, etc., etc. But anyway, we'll talk about that later.
Back to you, Trenton.
Great, thanks. See you later, Linda. Thanks for that. Stay tuned. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, subscribe. We come to you every single week with all the latest, greatest things happening in the cannabis industry across the African continent, as well as a few global bits and pieces. But right now, we're going to cross the Limpopo province. I'm going to Limpopo province tomorrow, actually. So, Brett, I'll see you in person. We're going to cross there to Brett Hilton-Barber for the headlines. Over to you, Brett.
Good day from the CannaSphere news desk in Limpopo, where the sun is shining and the weather is sweet. We started in Pondoland, where there's the first evidence emerging of how cannabis farmers have been losing out since the historic Constitutional Court ruling allowing the private consumption of cannabis. Dutch academic Tim Jan Groeten of Wageningen University in the Netherlands is a specialist in cannabis and development, and he's been studying the economic impact of the Concord ruling on Eastern Cape cannabis farmers, and he says the situation is bad. He says traditional cannabis growers have been blindsided by the mushrooming of modern illegal grow ops closer to city centers that are producing high-quality commercial strains, and that a cannabis stockpile is developing in former Transkei. He said at 2 villages alone, there was a stockpile of 3.8 tons of TK, that's Transkei landrace. And he says the question needs to be asked, why is there all this fuss on protecting local land races when the farmers are not benefiting from it economically? There are only a few more days to make your submission on the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill. The deadline for public input is this Friday, 13th of May. Already over 2,300 submissions have been sent to Parliament. That's via the Dear South Africa Public Campaigns platform, and we urge you to make your input. They make it really easy. Just Google Dear South Africa and click on the latest campaigns button, and you'll see how easy it is to take it from there. Once the submissions have closed, the bill will be redrafted and put to the National Council of Provinces for ratification, after which it will become the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act. One of the main provisions, besides enabling the future commercial trade in cannabis, is for the establishment of a new cannabis authority, which will be in charge of all regulatory issues concerning hemp and cannabis. Government is pushing hard to get the bill passed into law this year, but several legal experts have warned that in its present form, it won't pass constitutional muster because it discriminates against people who don't have access to private land on which to grow their cannabis. The chorus of private sector voices calling on government to urgently change anti-cannabis laws is getting louder and louder. And the main culprits of the statute books are the Drugs Act, which defines cannabis as a narcotic and allows police to bust hemp growers if there's too much THC in their crop. And private sector policy advisor, M. Ayanda Bam, says it's as easy as dropping the word cannabis from the act and it'll all change. Then there's the Medicines Act, which sets out the scheduling of cannabis products. Goodleaf CEO Warren Shewett says this is irrational and could be immediately changed while government works out the finer details of future cannabis policy. And then there's the Plant Improvement Act, which master grower Nati Ferreira says is a scary piece of paper because it criminalizes planting natural crops and provides for jail time. And by the way, Ferreira says he feeds THC flower to his pigs and they're as happy as the proverbial pigs in poo. But under hemp regulations, he's only allowed to use the fiber for commercial purposes and not the flower. Talking of cannabis-based animal food, here's a story. The Cannabis Research Institute in Paarl has done a pilot project with Piketberg chicken farmer Peter Ace to see the difference between hens fed with standard poultry feed and those fed with a hemp-based feed developed by Afriplex. It found that chickens fed with hemp-produced bigger eggs with a higher fat content. Now it's only a matter of time before healthy hemp-fed hen eggs are found on Cape Town shelves. And finally, US officials have stepped up their efforts to free American basketball star Brittany Griner, who's being held in a Moscow prison after being busted at a Russian airport with vape cartridges as the invasion of Ukraine began in late February. US officials now have called for Griner's release, saying that she's being held as a political pawn as she's already played 3 seasons for a Russian basketball team and previously had no such problem with cannabis residue found in her vapes. Griner is due to appear in court on May 19 and faces up to 10 years if convicted. Meanwhile, back in the US, several cannabis activists have accused Washington of hypocrisy over the Griner affair, saying there's still thousands of US officials languishing in American jails on cannabis charges that should be expunged. Back to you, Trenton.
It's also crazy and wild, you know. I mean, what a political faux pas to be in a situation where cannabis is now becoming, you know, the conversation of politics with Russia and America at the moment. Not a great situation at all. I think that the 2 things I wanted to highlight. First of all, you know, one thing we haven't realized, and a lot of people don't realize, is that, you know, although on the one hand we capacitated South Africans to grow and consume cannabis at home, which was an incredible a step forward. By doing that, we also incapacitated the rural farmers because of an oversupply. And I'm quite sad to hear there are 3.8 tons of Transkei sitting around. You know, if you look at the Canadian situation, which we touched on last week, you know, about them having to destroy, you know, 450 million grams of cannabis because they have an oversupply, and our country hasn't even got going yet, and technically we've got an oversupply. It's a little bit concerning, you know, don't you think?
I find it very concerning because time and time again, government has said that it wants to support traditional cannabis growers, but it's still got this weird idea in its head, the government's head, that it's going to persuade them all to switch to hemp. And, you know, you're going to get 10 Rand a kilogram for hemp biomass, as opposed to how much they're getting for high value, high THC flower. And so we're stuck with this contradiction in government policy that government wants to help cannabis farmers, but at the same time, the law hasn't changed and police are arresting them as we speak. And that's why the government is intent on trying to get the law passed as quickly as possible. But somebody should be telling the police to hold off.
Yeah, and that is one of the problems with the private purposes bill. It is anti-constitutional. It does not align with our constitution in terms of our personal rights. So while there are things of validity in that, and it is encouraging to see it moving forward, it's also disturbing because ultimately, you know, if it goes in and it doesn't pass because of these things that we all know are not constitutional, then we just end up going backwards, you know. Anyway, it's dynamic, exciting, frustrating, all at the same time.
You're right, you are. Cheers, Trenton.
Cool. See you later, Brett. Thanks so much. Right, we're now going to cross over to Noxy, who's going to tell us about TV weed moms that we love. Can you believe we're actually having a conversation about TV weed moms that we love? I mean, that's just mind-blowing. Over to you, Noxy.
Absolutely mind-blowing indeed. Good afternoon. Welcome to the CannaSphere Lifestyle Desk with me, the Kush Queen, with a husky voice today because I have the flu. In the comfort of my room because technology, we can do that now. Television is undoubtedly one of the most powerful mediums in media used to normalize things that were once taboo, like weed. So it's no wonder that we're seeing more and more content being made about cannabis. I mean, really think about it. How many scenes in your favorite TV shows or actual movies have you seen where cannabis is either a feature or at times the main premise? One of my favorite TV shows is an HBO series called High Maintenance that tells the story of everyday individuals, but there's just this one common thread. A dealer who rides around on his bicycle delivering weed to people in all walks of life. Now, we know Mother's Day has come and gone, but it would be a complete shame if we didn't mention all the wonderful moms out there, including myself. And to commemorate this beautiful occasion, we've rounded up 3 fictional TV weed moms that we absolutely love. And if you haven't watched any of these programs, well, you should. At number 3, we're going with Weeds. Now, Weeds was released in 2005, and it was ahead of its time for a variety of reasons. Not only did it touch on cannabis during a time when it was illegal, it chose to do it through a suburban mom. Nancy Botwin, which is the character, was a complex character and a flawed female. And flawed female characters have become more and more common nowadays. But Weeds remains impressive in its commitment to exploring Nancy's depths, no matter how far and disastrous. And number 2, we have Grace and Frankie. Grace and Frankie is currently in its 7th and final season on Netflix. Initially pitched as a show about 2 mismatched women who end up having to live together after their husbands divorce them and marry each other. Wild, but not so wild in 2022. In later seasons, Grace, who's played by Jane Fonda, and Frankie, played by Lily Tomlin, grow into best friends and companions. Frankie is a stoner since the minute she appears on screen, quietly luring Grace into the, well, for lack of a better word, dark side. In short, they're both stoners, guys. And Grace and Frankie is a stoner show, period. And at number 1, Disjointed. Now, Disjointed stars Kathy Bates as Ruth, a cannabis advocate who hires her son and a group of bud tenders to tend to her newly opened cannabis dispensary. The series only lasted a season, but it was a personal project for Bates, who explained that she turned to cannabis when dealing with her breast cancer diagnosis. How wild is that? Trenton, do you know any movies or TV shows that actually depicted weed and you were like, oh my God, that's so cool?
Yeah, what's the one with not Ice Cube? Yeah, Ice Cube.
Oh yeah.
Friday, of course, Friday. Yeah, no, those kind of movies I used to watch a lot
the
of.
Whole trilogy.
But isn't it? But that was all like the hip hop culture and the, you know, where it was kind of accepted in that culture. But how crazy is it that some of these programs are like with normal people who look like moms, and it's just insane how fast things have moved, you know. And if you look at how it's progressed in the States, and we still think of us being, it's almost like we're in the arcade, we're in the past, you know. Yeah. So it's exciting to see, and I think those are some great things you've highlighted. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Cool. I know you got a bit of a flu, so I hope you feel better.
I'm gonna go sleep.
Rest up. And we'll see you same time, same place next week. Noxy, thanks bringing us Canna Lifestyle as always. I'm always fascinated by the subjects that she brings in, just educating us on cannabis culture and all kinds of interesting and exciting things. Next up, Jeff is going to take us through personalized DNA testing. So they can basically take your DNA and, depending on what your DNA is, look at the best strains for you, depending on what you want cannabis for. So without further ado, Jeff, educate us, my brother, educate us.
So before I get into that, I'd like to highlight Pineapple Express, one of my favorite movies, James Franco and Seth in there. So great movie. If you haven't seen Pineapple Express, very funny. Traditional movie on weed dealing going wrong. So in terms of today's session, there's been a lot of talk for the last few years on personalized medicine, specifically looking at a person's genome. So since the Human Genome Project in the early 2000s, and identifying certain genes within an organism where there might be an issue. In this case, there's a company called basically Endocanna Health. They've been busy with this for about 4 or 5 years now, where essentially what they test for is, we all know the body has the indigenous endocannabinoid system. And in that system where you have anandamide and 2-AG that regulate the body through the CB1 and CB2 receptor, and there's additional receptors in this path chain, they've been assessing which genes are involved in modulation and regulation of the cascade effect of that interaction between CB1 and CB2 receptors, along with all the different carrier enzymes. And in that process, what they're able to do is start developing the science about establishing how CBD, how CBN, how CBG, how THC, how different terpenes will interact within your body and elicit a certain response. And it's been well established that a lot of the entourage effect is affiliated to a lot of the terpenes as well, not just the cannabinoids, in determining that indica or that sativa type of effect. And this is the type of science that we like to see, because ultimately it's going to inform physicians, clinicians, and doctors about the medicinal roots in terms of what right dosage is going to work for certain patients, for certain indications. But as for general consumers, it's great to know, what are the potential health benefits and potentially how DNA, besides the methylation that can happen within the genes that affect it, but ultimately what all that science is going to tell us about health in the future. So it's a really exciting space to keep an eye on. I know we've talked about specifically genomes of the plants in the past, about genetically sequencing 800 strains, but this is also how the strains interact with the human. And I think that's a fascinating area of biochemistry and genomics. Now to our news internationally. I mean, the biggest news was that New York came online with 52 licensed cultivation sites in the last week or so. It's obviously been in the works for some time. In addition, we've seen the constant debate rage again in Kentucky, the state in the US, where they're still pushing to get medical cannabis approved. And it's kind of surprising. I mean, I think it's 38 states now in the US that have federal approval for medicinal, and quite a few of those are obviously adult use as well. But Kentucky is still struggling to get it through, and the governor has recently insisted that he's found a loophole to drive legislation forward in Kentucky. And then going to the completely other side of the world, in Nepal, between Tibet and India, they are pushing again to go back into legalization. It used to be back in the 1960s that Nepal was famous for selling hash balls from government institutions, ironically, back in the day. Now they are fighting to bring medicinal cannabis back. I'm not so sure about adult use in the region, but Nepal is one of the few isolated areas besides Thailand that's pushing for cannabis reform, including obviously the native form of cannabis in India. So a lot of interesting news across the world at this point. Back to you, Trenton.
I find it so incredibly exciting that next time I go to New York, because I haven't been to New York for quite a few years now, but I remember when I used to go there quite a lot at one point, and it was always a mission to try and get weed. Like, I had to do some dodgy deal on the side. It was always, you're in New York, it's this big, crazy, energetic city, and then you're skulking around as a foreigner trying to score some weed from some big, dodgy oak, and next time I go there, I'm actually going to be able to walk in to a store and actually get like whatever I want, and that is completely liberating. Are you a consumer while you travel? Do you try and find?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, traveling. Yeah, I've been to Amsterdam a few times. For me, it'd be amazing to be off Broadway or to go into Times Square and actually see a dispensary in Times Square. I think that will be kind of the height of legislation. But that said, I mean, it's such a disparity to have it federally legal and to still see people crossing state lines, getting prosecuted and picked up by local state and sheriff's officers. I mean, it's really necessary, I think, at this point that the US federalizes. How that plays out is going to be a whole different debate. But I think it's really important that there's a standard set, or at least decriminalization across the entire United States, so that we can just get rid of the disparity. Because it's going to be ridiculous to just see Times Square selling cannabis, but at the same time, people still incarcerated for these crimes.
Completely. It's such a juxtaposition, and it needs sorting out, But it's exciting. Cool, Jeff. Thanks so much for that. We'll see you again next week. Have a great afternoon. Next up, we've got Dr. Carmen, who's going to be talking about cannabis and fatigue.
Hi there, I'm I'm Dr. Carmen, and today we're going to be talking about cannabis and fatigue. Now, fatigue is one of those symptoms that accompanies many different chronic medical conditions. Things like cancer, chronic pain syndromes, multiple sclerosis, and many others are often associated with fatigue. And it's conventionally accepted that cannabis actually increases your level of fatigue, reduces motivation, and reduces your ability to complete tasks. But an interesting journal article in the Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoids journal titled "The Effects of Consuming Cannabis Flower for Treatment of Fatigue" showed something very different. Now, in this study, they were looking at 1,224 participants that were using a mobile app, and they were using the app to track their symptoms after they used different types of cannabis. And what they were able to identify and track in the study is people's response to cannabis with regards to fatigue levels in real time on a scale of 0 to 10. And what the study showed is that 91% of people in the study sample that used the cannabis flower to treat fatigue reported an improvement in their symptoms. And this improvement in their symptoms, interestingly, was independent of the type of cannabis, namely independent of whether it was high THC, high CBD, whether it was a cannabis sativa, a cannabis indica. Generally speaking, 91% of participants noticed an improvement in their fatigue level, regardless of which type of cannabis they were using. Now, this was quite interesting because one of the observations is that the THC level, the CBD level were largely uncorrelated with the changes in feelings of fatigue, which actually suggested that it could potentially be other components of the cannabis plant, things like the minor cannabinoids, the terpenes, the phytochemicals, that were even more influential on the overall effect of the plant. Now, more studies are definitely required to be able to verify this information, but this could potentially present an interesting opportunity to include cannabis as one of the treatment options for chronic fatigue, as opposed to people relying on things like supplements that may be harmful, as well as harmful energy drinks.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. I'm learning every single day. That's why I'm glad we actually do this program, because I learn just as much as hopefully you learn. Jeff, I know you're still around and Noxy's not around. I just wanted to ask you and Brett, what are your concerns over this bill? Because this bill is quite hot right now. So what are your concerns in terms of the bill?
Yeah, I would just maybe say, I mean, it's important to address commercialization, but I'm not so sure if the name of the bill, private purposes, is perhaps the appropriate setting. I think two bills would have made sense for two different points of comment and positions. But I do agree with what Brett mentioned earlier, is constitutional muster. I'm not sure if this is really going to, I mean, I've always had this opinion where it would have been better to get a far simpler version of the bill through in 2020, so people's rights were protected from the police. And that should have been simple. It should have just been like what you can carry in public, what you're allowed to do, but it's never that simple with the law. But Brett, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, I think that most of the stuff has already been said, Trenton. I think that the thing of major concern is them keeping the acceptable level of THC in hemp at 0.2%. And that, against government's own advice, is unrealistic. And it's just, why bring a law into being that's nonsensical to start with? It tears me up to sort of see how such a thing can come through. But it's still going to be redrafted one more time before it goes to the National Council of Provinces, and there might be time for revision. As you said, as we saw earlier, over 2,300 submissions so far, and more to come in the next few days.
Which is great to see that people getting involved. And I think the challenge with this is that I think as we get more into this industry and as more people get involved, we I think in the beginning we just misunderstood how complex this industry is and how many different verticals there are within the space. So by having this private purposes bill, which is the only kind of legislation floating around at the moment, everybody's latched onto this. And I agree with Jeff, there should have been different iterations of it. There should have been the private purposes bill, there should have been a commercial bill, and there should have been a bill for agriculture, but it all kind of got mishmashed into the same thing. And I think we've been trying to dig ourselves out of that hole since then. When do you think, what are your predictions on when you think we're actually going to get an answer on this?
I reckon we're going to see some piece of legislation come before the Council of Provinces this year, possibly August, September. I don't know if it's on the parliamentary calendar yet, but I think that in all likelihood it's going to be problematic and there's going to be legal action. So I think we're a good 2 years away from getting a new piece of legislation that does cover all the bases. And I know comparisons aren't really useful sometimes, but we're dealing with one piece of cannabis legislation in South Africa. Right now in the United States, and it's very different, there are all sorts of things happening at the state level and the federal level. There are 1,400 marijuana bills being tracked in various houses of legislature across the states. So, one law can't cover it all.
Mpondi has just said in Rwanda, that an SA company was granted a permit to grow cannabis. I mean, that is what's going to happen eventually. It already is, we're already sending our guys into Zim and the SADC region. But if other countries bring on their legislation a lot quicker than we do, then we're going to end up, departing to places where we can do business properly. So it's got to come online. Guys, we've run out of time, but thank you so much. Appreciate it as always. This is CannaSphere Africa, where we bring you all the updates on cannabis across the African continent and a little bit of international stuff. Join us, same time, same place. If you're watching the rerun, please subscribe, tune in, be part of the community, and let's build this beautiful industry together. See you next week. Ciao.
Yeah.